As the clock strikes just past 8 p.m. here in Johannesburg, South Africa, and 9 p.m. in Jerusalem, I extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us tonight. To our live audience in Johannesburg, your energy fills this room. And to the thousands watching via Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook, your global presence amplifies our voice. Together, we are a united front, bound by shared values and an unbreakable spirit. Brooke, thank you once again for traveling all the way to South Africa. I have no doubt the warmth of our community has embraced you. We thank you for standing for us. We thank you for standing with us. To all of you here, thank you for joining us. Together we say, the people of Israel live. Am Yisrael Chai.
Amen. Okay. All right, well, am I using this or this? Test, test. Should we move both at the same time? Is okay? All right. Good evening, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. I can't even describe the trust and the warmth that this community has shown me. I already see so many faces in the audience that I can now call friends. About 7 years ago, I received an invitation from a good friend, Nikki Raz, to speak in South Africa. And at that time, she was serving as the national director of the South African Zionist Federation, and she had a very clear vision. And this vision has finally become a reality. And although she lives in Israel now, and she was supposed to be with us here today, she was stuck in Israel because of the ongoing war. Her spirit is here with us, and I want to say specifically a deep, deep thank you to Nikki Raz for organizing this and for inviting me here to this wonderful country. Also, a very special thank you to the sponsors of tonight's event, the South African Zionist Federation, and to Stacey Dembo and her incredible team, and of course, to Howie Sackstein, who I keep saying is a real national treasure, who has dedicated himself and his time to me over the last couple days. I'm extraordinarily grateful to you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, I want to make one thing very clear. I have a very deep respect for the South African Jewish community. You are organized, you are proud Zionist Jews. I am very impressed with the work of Wendy Kahn and her team, who now have over 9 lawsuits that are currently being litigated. And under no circumstances should I be seen as coming here to preach to you or to tell you what to do. Rather, I just want to tell my story of how I got to where I am today, to the point where I'm now running a network of over 1,000 attorneys from around the world and 42 major international law firms. We have filed over 100 cases in 17 jurisdictions around the world, and we are succeeding in demanding equal protection for the Jewish community and that our civil rights will be enforced. I want to emphasize what the rabbi said before, and obviously a special thank you to the chief rabbi for coming and speaking to us. It's an honor. We have a responsibility as citizens of a democracy, whether we're in the United States, whether we're in Canada, whether we're here in South Africa, to stand up for ourselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the distinction, both in my speech and with Howie, the distinction between pro-Israel advocacy and civil rights or human rights advocacy and mobilization, and why that distinction is important. So it all started for me when I was 24 years old. I was a student, I was a third-year law student at Cardozo Law School in New York City, and I was studying actually to become an entertainment lawyer because I thought that was the sexy thing to do. And I happened to be taking an elective class, which everybody says was an easy A, and it was called Human Rights and the Child. And in that class, we were learning about all of the lofty conventions and treaties that made up what we call international law, specifically as it applies to the protection of the child. We were learning about the UN Charter, about the optional protocol to the UN Charter, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so forth. And there was actually a special focus to the plight of child soldiers in Africa. And it was at that time, in the middle of this course, that I ended up coming home one day and broadcast before me on television while I was doing my homework and I was eating, I was also watching the news. Broadcast before me was an image of a 15-year-old, physically handicapped, rumored to be mentally handicapped child named Hussam Abdo, a Palestinian Muslim child, who was caught at a checkpoint with live explosives strapped around his waist. You might remember the image. And his hands were in the air, and he was turning around for the international media as the IDF was sending in a robotic arm to cut off his suicide belt. And it turns out that just 48 hours prior to this incident, Hussam Abdo had been recruited by the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, a designated Islamist terrorist group. He was paid the equivalent of $20 US dollars, to take his own life and the lives of others. He was told not to tell his parents where he was going. He was driven to the checkpoint, the Hawara checkpoint, and he was told to blow himself up amongst the Palestinians who were waiting online to get into Israel. But fortunately for those people, and obviously fortunately for the IDF soldiers who were guarding the checkpoint, Hussam proved smarter than the adults who recruited him. Why? Because he chickened out. He chose life over death. He was subsequently arrested. He was tried and convicted of attempted murder. And he was sentenced to 8 years in the Hasharon prison just outside of Jerusalem. And at that moment, while taking this class, it occurred to me that the child suicide homicide bomber is as much a victim of a human rights abuse as would be child soldiers that we were learning about in Africa, who were recruited against their parents' will, who were indoctrinated, who were drugged. Drugs play a huge role when it comes to the recruitment of children for violent activities. In fact, when I interviewed the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades in Jenin, they gave me a block of hash to thank me and explain to me how they smoke up the kids before they send them. And particularly after Hussam Abdo turned himself in, they didn't want the children to do the same. They were strapping remote-controlled bombs on the children and blowing them up by remote control. At least 2 children were blown up by remote control after Hussam Abdo turned himself in. And it occurred to me that there was this legal argument here that was not being made by Hussam's defense team, that he was an innocent party. And yet the Israelis were really stuck between a rock and a hard spot, because on the one hand, you know, this is a juvenile. He was subjected to abuse. But on the other hand, they can't just release him into the society that just tried to kill him. They would no doubt kill him again because he was a traitor. He was a collaborator with the Zionists. And in fact, when I went back to interview Hussam a year later, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, when he first told me, I interviewed him in prison just a couple days after he was arrested. He explained to me, I said, well, why didn't you blow yourself up? And he said he was scared. He was worried that his house would be demolished by the IDF, because that's the policy if there's a suicide bomber. And in this particular case, it was a deterrent that they demolish the house of the families of suicide bombers. And he didn't believe in the whole heaven thing. He wanted life. He wanted to live. I went back a year later to interview Hussam in prison after spending 1 year in an Israeli prison with, you know, factions of Hamas and Fatah and the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades and Islamic Jihad. He changed his tune. he became more radical in prison than he was outside. And he said, well, you know, I pressed the bomb 1, 2, 3 times, and it was defective. It didn't explode. But I really wanted, you know, to make myself a martyr, to become a shaheed. I desire, you know, shahada, which is what they call it. And so at that moment in law school, you know, it occurred to me that there was this human rights violation happening en masse to Muslim children that was being widely ignored by the media. It was obviously being ignored by our politicians, and it was being ignored by human rights groups. Because, you know, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers do great jobs producing report after report on the plight of child soldiers everywhere else in the world, but have intentionally ignored and have outright refused to issue any clear, consistent condemnation of the fact that Muslim children are being used by theologically motivated terrorist groups to be child soldiers, to be used as human shields, as we see particularly in the current conflict, where UNRWA schools are used as rocket depots and hospitals, women giving birth, are used as human shields for Hamas headquarters. They refuse to consistently condemn this human rights violation of the highest order, state-sponsored mass infanticide, child murder, because they're killing Jews, and it's okay. And it's, you know, politically incorrect to criticize these groups, because then you would have to admit that there's a deeper root to this conflict. And in fact, what I realized at that time is that the root cause of the conflict in the Middle East is hate education. No child, you know, hatred is an emotion, right? We're all born with it. But no child is born hating Jews. This is taught. It is systemic. Palestinian Muslim children are taught from infancy, through their school textbooks, by their television programs, by their religious leaders, by their political leaders, and often by their own parents, who I met, that the greatest thing that they should aspire to is jihad, is to kill Jews and to kill themselves in the process. And the indoctrination is so deep and so strong that when I interviewed children in Judea, Samaria, they would describe to me in detail what heaven would look like after they blow themselves up. They actually did not believe that when you blow your limbs to pieces, you die. In fact, they believe, and they've been taught, that you go to heaven, that you're going to be rewarded. And one young girl described to me how she was going to build a 4-story house of white marble in heaven, and it's going to have a Ferris wheel in the back and a carnival, and these are the, you know, family members that I'm inviting, and these are the family members that I don't like and I'm not inviting. And so I wrote my thesis on this subject, that one of the greatest crimes against humanity is the intentional murder of children, and that there is no excuse, religious, political, moral, or otherwise, to kill a child. I ended up raising about 250 Canadian dollars, and I traveled to the Middle East. And I spent the next 2 years at great personal risk, going into Jenin, into Ramallah, into Tulkam and Nablus and surrounding areas. I secured first-hand interviews with leaders of terrorist organizations, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. I went into Israeli prisons, as I mentioned. I interviewed children who had attempted to blow themselves up and children who were used by adult groups to recruit other children. I went into kindergartens. At one point, we went into a kindergarten run by Islamist Jihad, where we sat children around in a circle, kindergarten-age children, and we played a game. What do you want to be when you grow up? And every child answered shaheed, martyr, except for one. And one child said, I want to be a teacher when I grow up, to which his teacher quickly then shut him down and corrected him and said, no, you tell the camera that you want to be a suicide bomber. I interviewed the family of Wafa Idris, the first female Palestinian Muslim suicide bomber. She blew herself up in a crowded Jerusalem marketplace. She killed one person. She injured 100 more. She was lauded across the Middle East as a hero, as an example of what occupation does. The occupation is so bad that it's driving women to blow themselves up because there's nowhere else to go but up. They have no choice. That's how desperate they are. Turns out, Wafa Idris, and this is from her mother, who I interviewed, was divorced. She was barren, and she was accused of adultery by her husband, who needed an excuse to divorce her, and she was shamed. And she was told, either we stone you publicly and we bring shame to the family, or you can go and choose to blow yourself up, kill a bunch of Jews, and then you're going to get our pay-for-slay stipend program. And one of the first things that the mother asked me when I came to interview her was, where's the money? Where's my money that I'm supposed to get every month? And I said, well, I don't represent the Palestinian Authority, but I'll relay the message. I interviewed the sister of Hussam Abdul, who held up a certificate for me from Hamas and explained to me how now she was proud of her handicapped brother who was teased, who was marginalized, who was excluded from the community, but now she can hold her head up high. But for Hussam's parents, these brave parents spoke to me on camera and condemned what happened to her child, because she did not believe that what was going on to children, and she risked her life to speak to me on the camera about this, she was against it. And I urge all of us to speak publicly against the use of Muslim children in this context. And there's nothing Islamophobic about it. And what's ironic is when I released my film, we ended up actually winning the Audience Choice Award for Best Documentary Film at the 2006 United Nations Documentary Film Festival. So we were on stage being given an award by the very entity that itself is complicit in this crime through UNRWA schools, the United Nations Relief Works Agency schools, that have literally invited the Hamas youth wing, Al-Qutla al-Islamiyah, into the schools. They hire teachers off the Hamas payroll. On October the 7th, an UNRWA employee funded by Western governments kidnapped and murdered an innocent civilian after October the 7th, and they haven't still been held accountable. We were given an award by this entity. And literally overnight, I was 26 years old. I had never made a film. This was my first film. I had never engaged in any public speaking. I had never been on TV before. Literally overnight, I was thrust into the public spotlight. I traveled the world to different film festivals. We were in Brooklyn Film Festival, the Alaska Film Festival. After the screening of the movie, I started engaging in public speaking because they do a Q&A with the producer director after. I was invited to the State Department. I was invited to the White House. I was invited to U.S. Central Command in Texas. They asked me, and I turned over all 92 hours of my footage to them because they kept asking, what are we doing to create such hate? After 9/11, we did not understand in the West, we did not understand the Islamist theological mentality of suicide, homicide bombing. We're saying, what did we do to create this hate? What can we do to fix it? Well, that's the wrong question. The wrong question is, what did we do? The right question is, why are they teaching their children to love death and to hate life? That is the right question. And I was, thrust into the spotlight, and I started publicly speaking about the threat of radical Islam. I started publicly speaking about what I saw. And ironically, everyone that was doing what I was doing, which is talking publicly about the threat that radicalization, particularly that which is theologically motivated, the threat that radicalization poses to all Western democracies equally, not just Israel. 3 things started happening. Number 1, there were violent physical attacks and murders of anyone who was talking publicly about this issue. You might recall the murder of Theo van Gogh on the streets of Amsterdam for producing a film with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Geert Wilders called Infidel about Submission. That's her book's name. The film was called Submission. It's about the treatment of women under Islamist law, and it actually featured a clip of a radical imam preaching that women should be killed, that Jews should be killed, that Westerners should be killed. That radical imam ended up suing the producers of the film for hate speech, which is kind of like an admission, right? Because like if what you're doing is featured in the film is hateful, you're admitting what you're saying is hateful and unlawful. But Theo van Gogh was stabbed in the back and murdered on the streets of Amsterdam, and his last words were, "Can we talk about this?" The offices of Charlie Hebdo, that produced the now infamous cartoon of Muhammad, the Danish cartoon of Muhammad with a bomb in his turban, were firebombed. If we can't laugh about it, if we can't make jokes about it or cartoons about it, if we can't talk about this stuff, we won't be able to understand it. So there was the physical violence. Everyone who was doing what I was doing started being called Islamophobic or anti-Muslim. We were slandered, which I also found a little bit hypocritical, given that if I risked my life as a young lawyer and filmmaker to make the argument that Muslim children are innocent, Muslim children don't deserve to die, if that argument is anti-Muslim, what then is pro-Muslim? And isn't that the bigotry of low expectations that we talk about all the time? So they started getting slandered, they started getting physically attacked, and people started getting sued. So what I did, well, I'll give you an example of one of the lawsuits. The Islamic Society of Boston sued 17 media defendants, including my former boss, Daniel Pipes, at the Middle East Forum, for writing articles about the fact that Saudi Wahhabi funds were going into mosques, particularly this one, and radicalizing the local population. These 17 media defendants who reported on this issue got sued. They got sued for defamation, and the first thing your lawyer is going to tell you if you're sued for defamation is zip it. People stopped talking about the issue. The FBI stopped investigating the mosque, and lo and behold, the two Boston bombers who were allegedly radicalized at ISB blow themselves up and kill people. And I wonder if that lawsuit that we call the Lawfare lawsuit, the use of the law as a weapon of war to silence and punish anyone who's brave enough to talk about national security threats, to put a high price on the cost of free speech about these very pertinent and important issues, if that lawsuit wasn't filed, would the FBI investigation have continued? Would we have had the Boston bombing attack? So after I did my film, I ended up founding, together with Daniel Pipes, a litigation defense fund. And we raised millions of dollars to provide pro bono legal representation and financial support to anyone who was wrongfully and frivolously sued for speaking out against radical Islam. One of my clients was Hassan Dayoul Islam, an Iranian-American Muslim man who fled Iran. His family was still there and under threat, fled Iran, came to the United States thinking that he could exercise his First Amendment right to free speech, and he started writing a blog about NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, and its head, Trita Parsi, who you would often see on networks like CNN, advocating and lobbying for the Iran deal. Now, Hassan Dayoul Islam wrote a blog calling NIAC, quote, the lobbying arm of the Iranian regime, end quote. NIAC and Trita Parsi turned around and sued him for defamation in an attempt to shut him up. We provided him with pro bono legal counsel, with financial support, and right in the middle of the discovery process, where our client has the right to discover the truth of what he's alleging, NIAC destroyed all of their electronic and financial documents and were sanctioned by the court 6 figures for the obstruction of justice in that sense. Now, the more that I represented counterterrorism officials who were sued for testifying to the Canadian government about Muslim Brotherhood Front organizations, and the more we kept, raising money and litigating on the defense, the more I realized that we need to go on the offense. The more I realized that millions and millions of dollars were being invested in a strategic legal lawfare offense, not just against, American counterterrorism experts or journalists, but against Israel. and that the legal system was being manipulated. We had funds, the Muslim Legal Fund of America, the Council on American Islamic Relations, a Muslim Brotherhood front organization, and an unindicted co-conspirator in a terror financing trial, together with groups like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Center for Constitutional Rights, who are each working on their own, but taking advantage of the legal system to pursue their goals. And so I realized, I want to work for a Jewish civil rights litigation fund. Why are we on the defense? The truth is on our side. The law is on our side. We've been victimized. There are Jewish students, Jewish professors, Jewish doctors, people whose civil rights are being violated everywhere. How come we haven't organized a strategic legal offense on our behalf? And at the same time, Israel is being attacked relentlessly through the ICJ's advisory opinion, which declared Israel's security barrier, right? Brick and mortar and barbed wire and fencing a crime against humanity, a violation of international law, while the very justices refuse to enter into evidence the relevant fact that the barrier contributes to a loss, to a lowering of the loss of civilian lives through terror. You think that would be a relevant fact that the court would consider? The court refused to enter into evidence the testimonies of terror victims, Muslim, Christian, Jewish terror victims. That's not justice. That's lawfare. That's a manipulation of the law to undermine the rule of law, because they understand that where they cannot defeat Israel, they certainly cannot defeat Israel or America on the battlefield. What they can do is manipulate the legal system, which then plays into the whole concept of why the Islamist terrorists use asymmetric warfare, why they use child suicide bombers, why they use civilians as human shields, because they know the world doesn't give a damn about the lives of Palestinian Muslims, but rather they would have them sacrificed just so they can accuse Israel of war crimes. The war crimes charges against Israeli officials, so Ariel Sharon at the time, and even Bibi Netanyahu recently, couldn't even land in the UK, a friendly country, out of fear of an arrest warrant, while Hezbollah and Hamas are crossing European and potentially South African borders with total impunity. That's not justice, that's lawfare. And there was no organized communal response to go on the offense to secure our rights and hold the perpetrators of human rights violations accountable in courts of law around the world. So in 2010, I founded the Lawfare Project, which is the world's foremost Jewish civil rights litigation fund and public interest lawfare. And we have filed, as I mentioned, over 100 cases in 17 jurisdictions. I'm going to tell you, because Howie told me, don't talk too long, just about 3 of those cases, and then I'm going to sit down and we're going to have a deep conversation. And the reason why I'm telling you about these cases is because there's a message in each and every one of them. And the message is, if the Jewish community unifies across political partisan lines, if we stand up for ourselves, and we support the students who are brave enough to sign on as plaintiffs unequivocally, miracles can happen, because our enemy is a paper tiger. And we are fortunate, as the rabbi said, to live in a democracy, and it is our civic duty to take advantage of the legal system, and there is nothing wrong with that. Every single minority rights, civil rights, human rights movement has used impact litigation, civil rights litigation, to pursue their cause. You have an incredible history here in South Africa of case after case after case that got rid and chipped away and got rid of the apartheid movement here. The reason why we have civil rights and equal protection is because of the seminal cases that were brought against the government to enforce the law. In America, Roe v. Wade, right? Women's right to choose. Brown v. Board of Education. One person, Brown v. Board of Education, got rid of segregation in American schools. The Asian community just recently sued Harvard. They got rid of affirmative action. Because in a liberal democracy, we don't make change with the sword or the gun. We make change through the court system. And there is nothing to be ashamed of that. In fact, we have more to be afraid of not doing something when our rights are violated than of doing something, because we encourage the continued violation of our civil rights with impunity. So I'll tell you about 3 cases, and then we'll move on to our conversation. San Francisco State University is the ground zero for the anti-Israel campus movement. It is where Israel Apartheid Week and the BDS vote started in America, imported obviously from here. It is where Yasser Arafat himself, an Egyptian, flew in the 1970s to San Francisco State University and established GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, which then became SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. My clients were student members of Hillel, a non-political Jewish student group on campus, and all they wanted to do was simply have a table at the student fair. At the beginning of the year, all the student organizations are able to table and recruit people to become members. The school denied them the opportunity to have a table. They said, no, you're not allowed. This is a Zionist-free zone. So we sued the school. And to our surprise, the fact that the school refused to give them a table was not contested. That was not an issue at trial. They said, yeah, we didn't give them a table, and we stand by that. But we're not anti-Semitic. We're anti-Zionist. And Zionism is a political point of view, and according to the California state anti-discrimination law, it's unlawful to discriminate against people because of their race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, and so forth. Political points of view are not a protected category. Therefore, we're well within our right here at San Francisco State University to create Zionist-free zones. Well, to that we responded twofold. Number one, who the hell are you to define Zionism for my client? For my client, Zionism is an integral part of his Jewish identity, is an integral part of our ethnic, cultural, and religious identity. The equivalent would be for a white person to tell a black person what it's like to be black or what the black experience is. You cannot do that. You have no idea what the Jewish experience is like and what Zionism means for our client. But even if Zionism is merely a political point of view, only Jewish students are given a political litmus test as a precondition to participate in school-funded activities. And that in and of itself is discriminatory. And by discriminatory, I mean Jews are being treated differently because they're Jews, no matter the litany of excuses, right? So in this particular circumstance, you don't go to the Chinese Student Association and ask them, well, what is your position on China's handling of COVID? And unless you're a good Chinese student, you can't participate here. You don't go to the Muslim Student Association and ask them, well, what is your position on Iranian nuclear disarmament? And unless you're an anti-Iranian regime Muslim, you cannot participate here. Only the Jewish students are given a political litmus test in order to participate, and that's de facto discrimination. We walked into court on day one, we settled the case. And not only did we basically change the entire California State University system's policy, but we got them now to write on their website prominently, quote, we recognize that for many Jews, Zionism is an integral part of their identity, end quote. Therefore, anti-Zionist discrimination is a civil rights issue. It is not a political issue. If you hate a foreign government or you are angry because there is a war happening thousands of miles away, you cannot turn around to a Jew and treat them differently and project your hatred of that government on that person because of their religion or because where they're born. Right? You can't go to a Chinese student at Columbia University, spit on them, and call them a dirty COVID spreader. That would be disgusting. And I'm saying this to you because it is absolutely revolting. But why is it that you can go to my client, Jonathan Carton, at Columbia University and spit on him and call him a dirty Zionist baby killer? Why aren't you equally as repulsed by that statement as you would be if a Chinese student or a Muslim student or a black student or a gay student was treated the same? Because politics are being used as an affirmative defense to discrimination. And in fact, the more that we respond to anti-Jewish discrimination with pro-Israel advocacy, the more we give them an affirmative defense to discriminate against us, right? I had a black civil rights advocate in the United States come to me, and she's like, I don't understand you Jews. I just don't get it. If somebody produced a report and said, well, you know, most black fathers abandon their children and are bad dads, I wouldn't respond to that with, well, actually, we created our own report, and in fact, only X% do that. I wouldn't respond with the facts and argue within their paradigm. I would say, you're a fucking racist. Get out of my face. And that's how we need to respond, not just with that kind of pushback, but with legal, social, and media consequences. The second case I want to tell you about is against the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild is the oldest lawyers guild in America. It has dozens of chapters, thousands, if not tens of thousands of attorneys who are members. The National Lawyers Guild passed a resolution, a BDS resolution, and we decided we were going to test that. We were retained by a business called Bibliotechnical in Judea and Samaria. And that business bought a half-page ad in the National Lawyers Guild annual journal. And the half-page ad said something like, National Lawyers Guild, congratulations for all your good work. Love, Bibliotechnical, Judea, Israel. Now, within the week, we got an email in writing. I couldn't believe how stupid they were. An email in writing saying, I'm sorry, we have refunded the $200 whatever that it cost for the half-page ad because, quote, we have a resolution. We don't do business with Israelis, end quote. We turned around, we sued the National Lawyers Guild for national origin discrimination because it is illegal in the United States to discriminate against someone in a commercial context based on where they live. And my understanding from this incredible meeting I had with the Zionist Federation, with Wendy Kahn and her team, is that you actually don't have national origin discrimination laws here in South Africa, which to me is astounding. So we sued them. Day one in court, we settled the case. We reversed their BDS policy. We forced the board to issue a new resolution saying that they do not endorse national origin discrimination. We forced them to send out emails to all of their chapters saying if you engage in BDS, you cannot use the NLG lawyer. And we forced them to do business with our client. We decided we wanted a full-page ad. They wanted to give it to us for free, but we said, no. We're going to pay for it. And we forced them to do business with our Israeli client, and we defeated BDS in New York State based on this settlement agreement. The last thing, I'm going to talk about the third case with you because I feel like we're running over, but I just want to say one more thing with regard to unity. President Trump, during his first term, signed an executive order which expanded Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the Civil Rights Act that guaranteed equality for blacks in America, did not cover religion, did not cover Jews. During his first term, he issued an executive order expanding the scope of Title VI. The Lawfare Project was the first organization to file an Office of Civil Rights complaint under Title VI. Half of the Jewish community came out against us. Why? Because it was President Trump that issued the order. Now, I'll tell you, if Obama issued the order, if Obama or Biden had, moved the embassy to Jerusalem, I would be the first one to stand there and congratulate them because Jew hatred is not a political partisan issue. And for too long, our community has been used, and accusations of anti-Semitism have been used as a political football, right? Trump is a Nazi. Trump is Hitler. That denies the unique experience of the Holocaust and what we lived through. Trump is not Hitler. ICE detention centers on the border in the United States are not concentration camps. We have to push back from the use of Holocaust terminology that deny the unique experience of the Jewish community. And half the Jewish community came out against the application of Title VI to the Jewish experience on campus. Could you imagine the Black community coming out against someone who's trying to apply civil rights law to protect Black students on campus? Only the Jewish community can do something so insane, because political partisanship has divided us to our own detriment. And so I'll conclude with the thing that I first said. When you unify the community around a simple issue, you take it out of Israel-Palestine. I don't care what your position is on the occupation. I don't care what you think of Bibi Netanyahu. I don't care if you're pro-reform or anti-reform. The one thing that we need to agree with is that the Jewish community is the oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history. And we deserve equal protection, and we will mobilize both, and we will talk about how to mobilize from a grassroots perspective, from bottom up. We will mobilize from a legal perspective with our impact litigation, and we will end Jew hatred in our lifetime. Because like I said, everybody is born with hatred, right? But nobody is born with Jew hatred. And I want to talk about the formula of how we can end Jew hatred in our lifetime. So thank you.
So, Brooke, it's wonderful to have you in the land of miracles. If anyone had told you 35 years ago that you'd be sitting in a country of free people, free to criticize their government, free to exercise their rights, people would have told you you were crazy. So it's fantastic to have you here in this land of freedom. But sometimes, although we are people who are free, we still feel maybe a little oppressed. And I think the Jewish community, both here and around the world, has been at the forefront of some of the biggest struggles in the world. The struggle for civil rights in America, the struggle for freedom against apartheid in South Africa, the struggle for justice in the Soviet Union. And yet, David Baddiel wrote a book a few years ago that said, Jews don't count. The rights that we fought for as a community don't seem to be applied to us. What's gone wrong?
Well, first of all, throughout history, right, we have this narrative. In fact, I just did a podcast with Pumi, which was where we sort of explored this whole notion of, well, you know, the Jews are white. You know, how can you say that you're oppressed? And she was basically repeating, she didn't believe it, but she was repeating what she heard, and she wanted to understand, you know, my response to that. And, you know, it's amazing how throughout time, there's always a reason to discriminate and to kill Jews. And during the time of communism, Jews are capitalists, so they have to be killed and persecuted. During capitalism, Jews are communist, right? For the Nazis, you know, Jews were vermin and poor and spreading disease. And for others, Jews are too rich and they have to be, you know, taken care of, and they're stealing state resources. It's, you know, what Dennis Prager said, there's really no definition of anti-Semitism other than you keep, you know, making up excuses to try and persecute the Jews. And now we find ourselves in a position where not shortly after the Holocaust, where 6 million plus Jews were murdered because we were not white, now we're being murdered because we're being accused of being white colonial oppressors. And even though some Jews are white presenting, because when we were colonized and we were subjected to genocide and we were forced to move out of Judea, Samaria, which is our indigenous homeland. If Jews are not from Judea, I don't know where the hell we're from. And we were raped and we were colonized and we were brought to Europe, and through intermarriage and all that kind of stuff, some of us developed white skin. But the Jews who remained in North Africa and the Jews who remained in the Middle East, they're dark. And the Jews in China are Chinese, and the Jews in Gardar are black. Because being Jewish has nothing to do with your skin color. It has to do with the ideologies and the values and the morals that you ascribe to, particularly Torah law. And the theme that really struck out to me when you gave me a tour of the Apartheid Museum. And what was incredible is because Howie was telling me everything that was not written on the walls. And what was not written clearly was the Jewish contribution to the anti-apartheid struggle. And it was deep. And Jews have been part of every single minority rights, civil rights movement in human history. And in fact, now is the time for us to demand allyship and for everyone that we stood up for to come to our aid. And the parallels were striking. I never knew that the phrase of the anti-apartheid movement was never again, right? At the end of the museum, you see all the posters, never again, but for the ANC, and pictures of what's happening. Never again is the phrase that we use to talk about the Holocaust. In fact, never again is now. I was also really taken aback by the parallels between the shanty towns, I don't know what the proper term is, that they built the black-only areas to live, and the plans of Buchenwald. They're exactly the same. The long barracks in sort of like an arched shape with, no running water, nothing, and the bunk beds, the wooden bunk beds inside, they were exactly the same. You have the Nazis in Germany, and then you had the Nazi parties that were here, that were literally doing the salute and took the Nazi swastika and just modified it a little bit. So I think what's going on is the fact that we've seeded the narrative, right? We've allowed this narrative, this historically revisionist narrative, that we are not indigenous to Judea, that we've somehow come there and colonized Israel, which if you just take a look at the map, you zoom out, you see, the Muslim world, which is a product of brutal colonization and suppression of local minority communities, and tiny, tiny, tiny little Israel in the middle. How does that make sense? How is Israel the colonial oppressor? And we've allowed this narrative to continue, and it comes back to the same thing that I keep repeating over and over again, because we have not had the bait seam to talk about the real threat of radical Islam and the shared threat of theologically motivated terrorism, where ISIS is on the border here, beheading and slaughtering black Christians, and ISIS and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and they're all the same. And the goal is to, establish the caliphate, to kill the infidels. It has nothing really to do with, peace agreements and handshakes and who's walking on the Temple Mount. It has everything to do with a religious war, and we've lost sight of being able to communicate that narrative because we focus so much on pro-Israel. It's a lot harder to get someone who cares only about or mostly about food on their plate and what school their kids are going to go to ask them to love a foreign country, not a person, a country that they've never been to, that they really have no connection with. It's a lot harder to do that than it is to talk about shared threats that we face. And we face the shared threat of radicalism, of radical Islam. And that has to be talked about because we need to demand allyship between the black Christian Zionist community and the Jewish community.
So give us a sense, because we don't live in the United States, but we watched the hearings in the Senate, and we heard these stories about what it's like to be a Jewish student on some of these campuses in America. Give us the taste and the feel of what Jewish students have been through in the United States.
So, first of all, the Lawfare Project was very honored to play a small role in those congressional hearings and work with the offices of people like Virginia Fox and Elise Stefanik, and to have our students testify and share information about their lived experiences. And it's absolutely awful. I mean, when I filed my first lawsuit against a school, I thought, okay, the problem is these radical groups on campus, and we'll deal with them and we'll work with the administration to make sure there are consequences. They're violating the student code and so forth. The problem is the administrations. It's not just the Jewish, the Islamist, pro-BDS student groups. The problem is deep. The anti-Semitism is systemic. It is in the professors. It's in the administration. One of the incidents we had actually also at San Francisco State University was when they invited the then mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, to come speak, these students were shouted down, and the speaker was shouted down by an angry mob threatening violence, that the police had to escort the Jews out of the room for fear that they would be attacked. And what we found out is that the police, the campus police, asked the administrators, can we remove the hooligans, the protesters, the ones that are violating the student code? And the administration said no. They gave the police a stand-down order. They apparently wanted to see what would happen. They were okay with leaving the Jews to get beaten up, and the police of their own accord decided that they were going to remove the Jewish students. Our campuses have had these pro-Hamas occupations where not just Jews, but professors, non-Jewish professors are being assaulted, where black janitors were beaten up at Barnard, I believe. We have property destruction, trespass, physically blocking students from getting into campus, interruptions of our lesson plans, actual lesson plans that are being funded by foreign entities. Qatar spends over $1 billion a year funding American college campuses and K through 12 education. They've actually authored curriculums that are now being used in K through 12 schools in the United States. They've globalized the intifada. The hate education has come to the United States in a tsunami and is radicalizing the population, and we are 15 to 20 years too late to work against this. And not only that, but when President Trump says we are going to enforce the law, when somebody lies on their visa application that they're connected to a terrorist group, when you come into our country, when you get a student visa, which is a privilege, not a right, and you violate our laws, you engage in criminal trespass and mass civil rights violations, you need to be deported. And yet half the country thinks that these people have a First Amendment right to break the law. And that's how muddled up and confused America is right now. And frankly, it is refreshing to come to this country because you do not have a systemic problem of Jew hatred here. You have people in government, for one reason or another, that are taking very troubling stances. And 100% you should speak out against that. But you don't have a culture of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism here. And I was saying, to Liron and Tamara over and over again, I came here thinking that, how can I help? How can I bring my litigation fund here? What can I do to help the Jewish community here? And what I'm leaving realizing is American Jews need the help of not only the South African Jewish community, but the black community here more than you need our help. And so that is the mission that I'm going back now to America, is to bring the ideology of mobilization and civil rights and human rights activism back to America to teach the Jews how to mobilize for themselves.
So within campuses in America, you told the story on Fox News about students being locked in a library, about the president of university locking herself in her room for her own protection, and then she abandons them. She leaves the campus, and she abandons the students locked up in the library. Tell us about that.
So we are suing Cooper Union, which is a school where exactly this happened. It was, I'm sure many of you saw it on social media. It's the image of the Jewish students cowering in a library with a glass window, and the pro-Hamas agitators banging on the wall, holding sticks as weapons, and threatening the Jewish students with violence. And what did the president of the school do? She locked herself in her office, and she decided to escape through a back door of the school and leave the Jewish students. Eerily similar to what happened at San Francisco State University. And what's so and I commend the students at Cooper Union for signing on to this lawsuit, but one of my greatest challenges, especially before October the 7th, after October the 7th, we've had a completely different mentality, thank God. But before October 7th, I didn't have problems fundraising, thank God. We didn't have problems filing and winning our cases, thank God. The biggest problem I had was convincing Jewish students and Jewish doctors and nurses and Jewish and Israeli businessmen to stand up for themselves in courts of law.
So tell us about Columbia.
What do you want to know? Turn on the news. I mean, what's going on there is absolutely insane. We just, we filed a lawsuit against Columbia University. We just settled the lawsuit. We're very pleased with the settlement agreement. I think it's an example of really the power of litigation. But it's not just Columbia, it's all of the schools. And it's not just the schools. We're so obsessed with what's happening on campus, and we should be. There was a study done that showed that whatever is happening on campus, the radicalization of the campus is central to determine the future level of anti-Semitism in the surrounding towns and community. It all comes from the campus. But we're now suing a psychology practice on behalf of two therapists, Jewish therapists, who were fired, who were kicked out of their practice because they wanted to treat Jewish trauma, and they were told that that's political. That's not a real medical issue. Jewish trauma is political, and talking about the trauma that Jewish people face after October the 7th, doesn't create a safe space for the other people who were in the practice, particularly the head of the practice, and they were fired. So we are suing that practice right now. We have sued hospital systems. One hospital system that we sued decided that on Easter it was going to broadcast through the hospital loudspeakers that Jews killed Jesus. I mean, can you imagine doctors treating Jewish patients, and that's what's being broadcast on the speaker system? We sued them. We settled the case. We're very happy with that case. What we find is that in order to stand up against Jew hatred, and I want to talk about that study we did, one of the most important things you need to do is impose consequences. And it doesn't always have to be legal consequences. But lawsuits are never enough, right? There has to be a 1-2 punch strategy. You have to change the culture. And that's why the End Jew Hatred movement was formed, and that's why grassroots mobilization plus impact litigation is really the winning strategy. I'll give you an example. When a student group wanted to host Leila Khaled during COVID, Leila Khaled is an avowed PFLP terrorist, and I think you know her name well because someone tried to change a street in front of the U.S. Embassy, and that was quickly quashed. This woman is the devil. She is a leader of the PFLP, a designated terrorist group. The student group was going to invite her to speak, to give a class to American students on campus. We approached the school. They said the typical, free speech, terrorists don't have free speech in our country, but they refused to shut it down. So we ended up writing a very strongly worded letter to Zoom, which is what the platform that they were going to host her on, saying, PFLP is a designated terrorist group. If you provide material support, a broadcasting platform, to a PFLP terrorist, you might find yourself in jail for 22 years. It is a violation of the Federal Material Support for Terrorism statute. You might find yourself on the receiving end of a civil lawsuit on behalf of terror victims. It's really not in your interest to do that. At the same time, we sent 150 activists, Jews and our allies, to show up at the parking lot in San Francisco of Zoom headquarters, where they chanted "End Jew Hatred" on Zoom. They had huge posters with the face of the CEO of Zoom, because there has to be a personal consequence. We invited the press and the media, and then everybody came with these really nice aerodynamic foam airplanes, which we put stickers on, I think with Leila Khaled's face, and we threw it at the side of the Zoom headquarters, and it was a whole stunt. And our attorneys were on the phone with the in-house counsel of Zoom as we watched live them shut down and deplatform the feed that Leila Khaled and take her off Zoom. Then they went to Facebook, and we did the same thing. Then they went to YouTube, and they did the same thing. And we successfully deplatform her because we showed that there will be social, media, and legal consequences for Jew hatred. And I have so many examples of what mobilization does. We have activists right now running for school boards across the country so that they have access to the curriculums, and we're going to go in and we're going to change the curriculum from within. We've had activists within 24 hours, we've had click campaigns with 45,000 clicks directed to elected officials and have successfully shut down pro-ceasefire votes across the country. We've had concerts canceled. We shut down Ben & Jerry's flagship store in New York for supporting a boycott of their facility in Judea and Samaria. We've had tenure denied to professors. We've had investigations launched into SJP. We had SJP banned at the University of Pittsburgh. Because of our mobilization click campaign against Air Canada, they have now taken down their map function, which they're rewiring, where it once said State of Palestine, is now going to say Israel. We've had a Jew-hating librarian fired after she went and was caught on camera ripping down hostage posters. And most importantly, we have gotten declared in the United States April 29th in multiple jurisdictions by proclamations of elected officials that April 29th is End Jew Hatred Day in the United States of America. That has never been done.
But Brooke, your reach goes far beyond, because we witnessed the pogrom taking place in Amsterdam after a soccer match not so long ago, and yet you've managed very effectively to sue people out of the United States as well.
Right. So we represent, at this point, I think it's about 82 victims of the Amsterdam pogrom. And it's a historic lawsuit. It's the only really modern day lawsuit against a city and the mayor and the people that we deem to be responsible for facilitating this pogrom and not providing protection to the Jewish community as they should. We're examining the role of certain companies when it came to facilitating the organization, of how certain taxi cab drivers got to pick up these Israeli victims, and instead of driving them to where they should go, their hotel, they drove them to a square where a mob was waiting to beat them up. This is a really important case. But I also want to mention there was a case that we lost. We represented Psagot Winery in a case where we sued the government of France. And we ended up losing that case, but in the end, even if you lose, you win. And I think that really should be something that you take on, because you cannot let fear stop you from standing up for yourself in a court of law. And if you file 100 cases and you win 80 of them, you're doing a really good job. So we represented Psagot Winery, which is an award-winning winery in Judea and Samaria. And the great irony of this case is when the CEO, Yaakov Berg, first started digging to plant his vineyards, he ended up digging into a cave, and in that cave he found hundreds of coins from the Second Temple era. And what were on those coins? A grapevine. And it was printed that these are the coins, and this was the area where the wine for the temple was being produced. So right now you buy Psagot Winery, you are drinking from the very soul that they would provide the wine for the temple rituals, which is incredible. So to say that, our presence in Judea is a provocation to terror is insane. And so the government of France decided that it was going to issue a regulation that says any wine produced in Judea, in the occupied territories by Israelis, aka Jews, you have to, in order to import into France, put a label on it that says product of an illegal Israeli occupation, illegal Israeli colony, they called it. So we sued the government of France because they don't have the same policies for any other country, especially anyone that could also be deemed to be an occupation. The case ended up going to the European Court of Justice, which is the Supreme Court of Europe, and we lost in what was an Orwellian decision. It was just horrific. We lost the case. We ended up then getting sued in Canada by an activist attorney that thought he could also replicate the success in Europe. We won in Canada, and the Administrative Trade Court in Canada ruled that according to the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, anything made within Israeli administered territories must be labeled Made in Israel. So what did we do? We turned around, and now we have a challenge against Made in Palestine labels, particularly anything. There was, I think, 2 olive oil companies and a Zatar spice company that said Made in Palestine, which we're arguing is false and misleading and a violation of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement that we just got interpreted by the court with our own lawsuit. This is a long game, right? We're always reactive, right? Even sometimes our lawsuits are reactive, right? Someone discriminates against us and we respond to that. But we need, and our enemies have a 5, 10, 100-year plan, and they're planning all the way to the end. We find ourselves, on 3-month planning. And even with our lawsuits and litigation strategy, what we need to do we need to see what are the things that we need to change in our society and proactively file lawsuits to see that change. But not just with litigation, even the campus strategy. So the pro-Israel campus strategy to date has been a BDS vote is coming in 3 months. We need to take the next 3 months to mobilize. We got to get all our votes against it. We're going to hand out pamphlets why Israel isn't an apartheid state, and so forth. Or Israeli Apartheid Week is coming. We got to respond to that. We should do anything, right? We should do something. There is a student group that we had the good fortune of working with called Students Supporting Israel. And they said, screw that. I'm not going to spend time, I'm not going to spend resources responding to you. Instead, of your BDS resolutions, I'm going to propose my own resolutions. So they started proposing resolutions, and our students at NJU Hatred Campus Fellows are proposing resolutions demanding the school recognize Jews are from Judea, demanding the school recognize that the Jewish community is a minority community, deserves equal protection. It doesn't matter if they win. In fact, recently in Berkeley, which is one of the most anti-Semitic campuses, our students proposed a resolution demanding the school recognize the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and they won. And what we found is on those campuses where instead of engaging in the defensive pro-Israel advocacy by responding to the accusations of our enemies, when the Jews started proactively asserting themselves, the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel activity on those particular campuses the following year went down 50%, 50, because they were too busy responding to our activism. And so proactive strategies that assert your Jewish identity, where you demand consequences, have an enormous effect.
You did something similar with Kuwait Airways. Tell us that story.
Yes. Okay, so, and then I want to talk about the NJU hatred stuff.
I promise you we will. And then after that,
Yeah.
we're going to open it to questions to the floor, as well as to those people who are watching us on Zoom and YouTube. So if you have any questions, please, very, very short. But if you'd like to ask a question on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook, or in person, we'll come to that in a few minutes' time.
So Kuwait Airways Corporation is the official airline of the Kuwaiti government, and the government of Kuwait is a very active member of the Arab League boycott. The Arab League boycott is where the whole so-called BDS movement started. And Kuwait Airways refused to fly passengers carrying an Israeli passport. So we sent our client to the airport and filmed him attempting to purchase a ticket on Kuwait Airways. He was denied. We turned around. We filed lawsuits against Kuwait Airways in multiple jurisdictions in Europe. We engaged in legal action against them in the United States. And what was remarkable is that we didn't even have to go to court. Kuwait Airways, to avoid liability, apparently, shut down over half of all of its flight paths. Every single inter-European route was shut down. Its JFK London route was shut down, and they remain shut down because they would rather lose millions of dollars than fly Israelis. And that is a real consequence. And I think that legal action cost me about, $10,000.
So, an amazing story. So let's talk about the campaign to end Jew hatred. You've created an army of thousands, tens of thousands of people, but it all started with a study. And what did you learn?
Well, thank you for asking me. So after being involved in litigation for about 7.5 years, I realized that we were missing this grassroots mobilization part. And actually, I was pregnant with my third child. It was in the middle of COVID. And I was living in Brooklyn. And Black Lives Matter was looting up and down Madison Avenue. They lit a cop car on fire in my neighborhood. And I'm white presenting and pregnant. I couldn't even leave my house. That's how terrible the agitation and the hostility was. And the appropriation of a good cause towards violence and disarray and so forth. And yet, a lot of my friends, even after the fraud was exposed, even after all the looting and the racism that Black Lives Matter showed to the Jewish community, kept hashtagging Black Lives Matter or blacked out their social media feed because they wanted to virtue signal, right? They wanted to feel good. They wanted to be part of the movement. Same with the Me Too movement, the hashtag Me Too movement, which posed as this, civil rights, women's rights group. And what's funny is that there are some social media influencers who went into the Me Too movement protests and filmed people saying, what are you here to protest? Equal rights for women. Okay, what rights don't you have? What are the laws that are discriminating against you? And none of them could answer because it had nothing to do with women's rights. In fact, what I found astounding is that the leaders of the Me Too movement, Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, were rabid anti-Israel, anti-American Islamist activists and, were manipulating the movement. And yet my friends who were pro-Israel Zionist Jews were taking their young girls to march behind these neo-Nazis with pussy hats on and hashtagging Me Too and being proud of it. And so I just didn't understand, the cognitive dissonance. And I didn't understand, we're in the age of minority rights movements, and yet shortly after, you might not recall, there was a barrage of rockets around, I think it was 2019, 2020, hitting Israel from Gaza. And I made a note of all of my Jewish friends who send their kids, to Jewish day schools, who are Zionist and pro-Israel, who are hashtagging Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too. I said, can you hashtag, something pro-Israel? Israel is under attack. Can you show support on social media just the way you showed support for these other movements? And every single one of them told me no. They said, Brooke, we love you. You're doing such great work. We know you support, we support you, but it's too political. I don't want the backlash. I don't want to be targeted at work. I don't need it. I don't want to get involved. And so again, we're the age of minority rights movements, right? It's not the same to be black as it was 20 years ago. It's not the same to be a woman in the workforce as it was 10 years ago. It's not the same to be gay as it was 5 years ago. Why is it still socially acceptable to engage in Jew hatred, and how come we haven't mobilized? So I ended up funding a study. And the study took about 3.5 months. And the study, I wanted to know, what are the strategies, the tactics, the messaging, the organization, how are they funded? Every single successful civil rights movement in American history, from the true black civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the women's suffrage movement, the Soviet Jewry movement, the so-called pro-Palestinian movement, the LGBTQIA+ movement, and the End Asian Hate movement is what we studied. And what we found from this study was remarkable. The number one finding is there has never been a Jewish civil rights movement in modern history. Never been a Jewish civil rights movement. We have been instrumental in every single minority rights movement, Jews for black rights, Jews for gay rights, Jews for these rights. We have never had a Jews for Jewish rights movement, right? When people say, well, how about the Zionist movement? Well, the Zionist movement was established 126 years ago by Theodor Herzl. It's not a civil rights movement. It was a movement for national sovereignty. It is a movement to take Jews out of the places that they've been discriminated against, establish a state where the Jewish people can exercise self-sovereignty and protect themselves. Well, I say you don't have to be a Zionist to have your civil rights protected. You shouldn't have to leave the country that you're in order to have equal protection. A true civil rights movement positions the Jewish community as a minority community here and now in the diaspora deserved of equal protection. We had the Soviet Jewry movement, again, about getting the Jews out of the Soviet Union. Super hot success, lasted a hot minute, got hundreds of thousands of Jews on the street throughout the United States, and we defeated the Soviet Union, and then it just fizzled out. There's never been a Jewish civil rights movement. End Jew hatred is the first ever Jewish civil rights movement in modern history. And if you believe in ending Jew hatred in your lifetime, you are part of the movement. And I also want to say, well, a lot of people say to me, how can you end Jew hatred? Right? Even the Torah says in every generation, they will rise up against us. It is this systemic virus that we've written hundreds of thousands of books about, but we still cannot understand what brings a mom in Germany who has young children to become a concentration camp guard and kill other children. Right? We can't understand that. And so the answer to that is what this study showed. How do we end Jew hatred in our lifetime? How can we mobilize? And the answer is fourfold. Ending Jew hatred is not about getting rid entirely of anti-Semitism. That is something only Hashem can do, and we just don't understand really the spiritual reason why we have this plague. It's told to us from the Torah, and we have rabbis here in the audience. They can explain it better than I can. But when Jews got the Torah at Har Sinai, Sinai and Sinat are the same. When the Torah was brought into the world, Jew hatred was brought into the world. Because if you're an anti-Semite, if you want to destroy morality, if you want to kill your kids, if you want to engage in adultery, if you don't want equal rights, if you want to be a despot and a dictator, if you don't believe in equality or freedom, you hate Jews because you need to destroy the Torah. What the Torah brought, what Jews brought to the world is monotheism, is personal responsibility. Under polytheism, if something's not going right for me, instead of praying to the sun god, I'm going to pray to the moon god, and it's not my fault, and I need a priest, an intermediary, and I can worship other human beings. We destroyed that. We said, we don't believe in authority. We don't bow down to other human beings. So every totalitarian dictatorship hates us and wants to kill us to this day because we refute the very premise that man is not God and man cannot suppress other man, right? So if you want to engage in the behavior that is prescribed by the Torah, then you're a Jew hater. We can't get rid of that entirely. But what we can do is impose consequences, because Jew hatred comes in ebbs and flows. And the difference is when it's up and when it's down is when there are societal, legal, political, media consequences, so that you create a deterrent effect, so that people think twice, right? Black Lives Matter did not get rid of anti-Black racism. And I'll tell you for sure that the Me Too movement did not get rid of male misogyny, right? But what they did is impose consequences for behavior they don't want to see. You cannot say the N-word. There will be social consequences, as there should be. You cannot behave like Harvey Weinstein did, or there will be consequences. Nobody wants to be like him. But when you engage in instances of Jew hatred and you see there are no consequences, then that is what encourages you. And I know that the chief rabbi talks about this a lot, and it's an avowed strategy of the Islamist left alliance, that they will push until they have resistance. And if there is resistance, then they will move and they will engage in other strategies. We have to impose the resistance. So what the study taught us, you need a Jewish civil rights movement, okay? Number two, the success of any civil rights movement, everything is in the name. Everything is in the name, right? Black Lives Matter. If you disagree with Black Lives Mattering, you are a racist. No matter what the institutional 501c3 is doing, you have to have a cognitive dissonance, turn a blind eye, and you have to agree with the basic premises that Black Lives Matter. The way that we describe ourselves is pro-Israel. This is a theme I'm going to continue to talk about. Okay? What we do when we say pro-Israel is we immediately set up a binary, right? If I'm pro-Israel, I recognize there's anti-Israel or there's pro-Palestinian. And if there's two sides, there's your truth, there's my truth. If I'm an objective person, I need to hear both sides. And if you're lucky, I'm going to come out somewhere in the middle. Right? That's why we call it end Jew hatred even, because it's so visceral and we mean what we say. Not many people actually know the origin of the term anti-Semitism. Who knows the origin of the term anti-Semitism? Who hasn't heard me explain it to them this past Friday night? So the term anti-Semitism was invented by German eugenicists as a pseudo-intellectual way of describing why all of the Semitic races are inferior, and we touched on that before, right? When one of my greatest friends and mentors and earliest supporters of the Lawfare Project and the End Jew Hatred movement is the great ambassador Ronald Lauder. And Mr. Lauder was so kind that he decided he was going to test the language out at his cocktail parties. And he said to me, when I accuse someone and say that's anti-Semitic, they don't care. But if I say, you're a Jew hater, they say, oh, no, I don't hate Jews. Because if you believe that hating blacks is wrong, or hating gays is wrong, or hating Muslims is wrong, so too must you believe that hating Jews for being Jews is wrong, or you admit that you are the bigot. So the second thing we learned is everything is in the name. The third and the fourth thing we learned is that every single successful civil rights movement is engaged in grassroots mobilization. Right? It used to be that if you want to solve the problem of anti-Semitism, you write a check to one of our storied organizations and they will solve it for you. But I think with the Zionist Federation, and I'm very pleased to continue to work with them, what they understand and what the study showed is that you have to engage in grassroots mobilization. There has to be a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. And we see it with other movements going into communities, rising up new leadership. Right? When I went to the offices of the Federation, Wendy showed me on the wall all of the examples of when the community showed up for themselves and really made a difference just by virtue of showing up for 1.5 hours at a protest. And so you have to have that 1-2 punch. So grassroots mobilization, and the last obviously was ensuring consequences. And every single civil rights movement has followed that formula to a T. And what I'm so encouraged is I'm coming here, and you are really the only Jewish community that I know in the world that is naturally following this formula. You're already engaging in litigation. You have this amazing historical history here in South Africa of physical mobilization, and you're doing it for yourself. And I'm really impressed and inspired by this community.
So I want to open it to questions from the floor now. We'll come to you after one question that's come online, and that is, can you speak a little about South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice?
So, there's nothing that I'm going to say that, hasn't been said. Obviously, this is the typical form of lawfare. There are studies that have shown that there is a deep Iranian connection to the bringing of this lawsuit. In particular, I think that it's a tired strategy. I think that it was a strategic mistake for Israel to show up and make the argument because the court is illegitimate and there was no reason for us to go. The court has no jurisdiction. And show up before the court and make the case for Israel as though we have to justify our existence. And then by virtue of doing that, we recognize that this court, even though it doesn't deserve to have, has some legitimacy and authority over us, which it doesn't. I think that was a huge strategic mistake, and I wonder if Israel hadn't sent Tal Becker, and he's an amazing attorney and orator, and he's fabulous. But if we hadn't sent him there, really would it have made would there have been as much news coverage and attention paid to it, because we should have just ignored it. And again, the fact that we haven't organized a legal offensive strategy, taking advantage, filing war crimes charges against the leaders of terrorist organizations in countries so that they can't move, filing our own complaints in courts of law around the world against the leaders of states. Now there was an amazing decision in the United States. A gentleman named Ari Fold was murdered, and after a long, arduous legal battle, and I commend the family and their bravery and their courage and how they stuck to it, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the Palestinian Authority, they have personal jurisdiction, can be held legally accountable for facilitating this terrorist attack. And that was after a long, hard fought and won battle. And so many people said, you can't do it. We have case law, they have immunity, no court is going to exercise personal jurisdiction, and they did it. And now it has opened up an opportunity to hold this pseudo-state terrorist organization accountable. in U.S. courts of law.
Fantastic.
Ran the case against Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters for singing Kill the Boer, which led to President Trump berating our president in the Oval Office and raised awareness of farm killings and the sort of brutality of that. We thought long and hard about running that litigation, and a lot of the arguments against running it were that it would provide the EFF with a big platform. How do you determine which cases to run and which cases do you stay away from?
So first of all, I want to thank you for what you did. We all owe you a tremendous round of applause for your effort. And I hope that we can connect after.
Mark is one of the great heroes of our community.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I think this is a perfect example of even when you lose, sometimes you win. And I think world opinion is squarely on your side. And this was, unfortunately, an example where the court publicly displayed their bias, and it's repulsive. And, most thinking rational people in public opinion agree. So even though technically you lost, it was a huge success. And so we are a public interest law firm, 501c3 charitable organization in the United States. We also are the same in Canada, and we have offices in Europe. We must bring cases that are in the strategic interest of the Jewish community and other minority communities. So let's say there's a Jewish woman, at an old folks' home, and she's not being served kosher food. And while it's tragic, if this is not a systemic issue, we are not using donor funds and community resources behind it. You have to solve a systemic problem. And so there's two types of cases: reactive cases that I mentioned before, someone is discriminated against. But then there are proactive cases where we look to see there is a problem. I don't know, hypothetically speaking, there's a problem of corruption in the government, right? How do we solve that? How do we use the local election laws? How do we bring cases to enforce the change that we want to see? And then we, have a board, and we have and I'm happy to share it with you, like a multi-point intake form where we analyze, obviously, the cost of the case because, we don't have unlimited funding. We analyze the strategic effect of it, obviously the chances of winning. There's a whole lot of things that we look at, but we're fortunate that we've had a lot of success with our cases. And the greatest success to see is how our plaintiffs are empowered. We had this one case where it was terrible. Even the local Jewish community leaders were coming out against this young man signing on as a plaintiff on our lawsuit against a major school. They were, telling us, "Shah, still, be quiet. We're negotiating behind the scenes. You're coming up and blowing up those negotiations. Never mind the students on whose behalf they've been negotiating for almost a year came to us saying we want to be represented." They wanted to deny them their civil right to enforce, their rights in a court. We were accused of spreading anti-Semitism because we're feeding into the narrative that Jews are moneyed up, and we're, abusing the court system, and we are silencing pro-Palestinian voices and free speech with our lawfare attacks. They reverse criticism. They accused us of everything that our foes are guilty of, and we filed a lawsuit. And in the end, the Jewish plaintiff was then hired by their local elected the office as the youngest ever person to be hired by a government office to be the liaison between that office and the Jewish community. And he became then the authority and the liaison. He was like 20 years old, 19, 20 years old. So it's how you choose them, and we can go through them, but also it's the effects of the litigation that are so powerful.
Bev, just before we come to you, a question from one of our online viewers. Is there a possibility of suing the BBC for what has often been biased and inaccurate reporting?
So the number one question I get from donors is, can we sue the New York Times? Because we care about the New York Times more than we care about the BBC. But so, look, every country has different laws. I'm not the expert on the UK laws. What I do know is there's a wonderful group called UK Lawyers for Israel, and I know that they've attempted and sometimes been successful going to different, I don't know what they're called, journalistic boards or what have you, but generally it's not been a successful strategy in the UK. In the United States, there is no group defamation standing on behalf of Jews, or I can't represent the state of Israel in a defamation claim against the New York Times. So what we do have are opportunities when particular people or groups that are definable, small and definable, to file libel lawsuits for misstatements of fact and for slandering and falsely defaming our clients. So I'll give you an example. If the New York Times publishes a report that says, Israel is killing Palestinian children intentionally, not actionable in the United States. That is why we formed the End Jew Hatred movement, because not everything is a lawsuit. I'm talking to you because you asked me the last question, but really I'm talking to the online. So we were actually turning away people who came to us with terrible stories of anti-Semitism, but we could not identify a viable cause of action. And because we were turning them away, we formed the End Jew Hatred movement, and then we engage in grassroots mobilization strategies to solve that problem, like standing outside. We went to the New York Times building, and we projected End Jew Hatred on the New York Times building, and that made media. What you can do, however, is let's say, I'm just making this like in a law school test case. The New York Times, hypothetically speaking, publishes a report that the IDF shot Palestinian children while they were collecting food at a humanitarian aid distribution site. If the unit, I could, hypothetically speaking, represent a definable unit. If there was an Israeli soldier that was there on the base, and it was a definable unit, they could theoretically, if they could prove personal jurisdiction in the United States, that there's connection enough, whether they're American, Israeli, or they have a business, or they have a bank account, or they own a home, so I can establish personal jurisdiction in the United States, so I can avail myself of the U.S. court system because it's a foreign issue. Or the New York Times is a New York-based, obviously, is an American-based company. And I can show that he was there, that he would be personally defamed. It was a false statement of fact. There could be a potential lawsuit by that individual soldier or potentially that unit against the entity. So that's why the most important thing to do is establish a committee of legal minds. And I want to thank, I think also Liran set up a meeting, and the South African Zionist Federation set up a meeting with, I think it was like 35 or 40 attorneys, and to sit down and literally map out, what are your possibilities here? What are the actions we could bring under the Constitution? What are the actions that we could bring on the reconciliation committees? I just today was briefed about this, so I'm not the expert on it. And then come out with a strategic plan and look for those cases.
Bev, you had a question.
First of all, thank you so much. I am slightly lost for words at what you said. I just wish there were 10 times more people sitting here tonight than there actually are. What a waste of some phenomenal information.
Don't worry, they're watching online.
I just want to say, I think we did a really good job. We reached capacity of the space that we were given today, and we have, I think it was like 3,000 people who signed up today online.
I don't know if you heard about the recent awful thing that happened at the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. There were Israeli runners, and they were so abused by pro-Palestinians who were running with them, next to them, and abusing them while they were running. And I was just wondering if there was any way that is a cause that actually could be taken up in South Africa, a pro-End Jew hatred cause. How would one go about doing that?
So, look, I can't tell you what is legally possible because that's the role for the Zionist Fed and for their attorneys who are licensed to practice here. I can just speak hypothetically. There are regulations. I'm sure that when you sign up for a marathon and you have to sign some sort of form and you have to agree to participate in a certain way, and if the organizers, which is probably a corporation, right, is not applying its own set of rules equally, there could be a potential discrimination claim. If they should have known who these runners are that abused, and they should be refused participation from any different rally.
Rather than asking Brooke for a legal opinion, let's leave it to the South Africans to actually take up the case. The next question is from Saul at the back.
Okay, let me just say one thing. So there's a legal response, potentially maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. Okay, it has to be evaluated, but then there has to be a communal response. And so what we do at the End Jew Hatred movement is we don't come and say, this is what you should do. What the movement is about is that the community needs to come together and you need to decide what your response is going to be to that. And then what we do is we provide funding, we provide strategic support. Like, for example, if you came to us and said, I want to organize a response to this marathon, I would partner you with people from my organization who would sit with you and design what your response is. And then we provide pro bono legal support so you can carry out the response that you want to see. But that is a question for you guys to determine for yourself. And I've seen so much creativity in that space. I have a group of incredible women who have come to me recently and come up with the brilliant idea of Artists Against Hate, of taking Never Again and creating a whole art institution with that and partnering with other minority communities. And they came up with that themselves. And my role is to just help facilitate that, whether it's funding or legal or back office, administrative support. You guys got to mobilize for yourself and you got to figure out how to do it.
So, quick question, and we've got a final question over there thereafter, and then we're going to wrap up with some advice that hopefully you're going to be giving our community.
I don't know if I have any more advice.
Well, then this question might not be relevant. After spending time here and seeing the incredible organizations that our community has built, you speak a lot about grassroots initiatives. After your experience meeting all of these people, can you give us practical recommendations of initiatives you've seen that you think would be applicable here?
What I would say to that is that I think that this community has enormous potential. You're fulfilling a lot of that potential already. And what my advice is to take advantage of my organization to strategically design responses to problems that you see. So I am not in a position, and I don't know enough about what the problems are in the community. I need you to map that out and then come to me, and I will partner you with strategists who are trained in mobilization to help you design your own responses.
So, final question goes to you.
Is it on?
It's on.
Okay, hi. Thanks very much for this opportunity, and thanks for being unbelievable. I just want to go back to, you mentioned the case where there was Made in Palestine, and there was some consequences of that. It brings me to the question of, is there a state of Palestine that exists? The South Africans, I believe, my opinion, quite confused on that. The South African government has an embassy for Palestine in Pretoria and one in Cape Town. You can go online and say Embassy of Palestine. They've got a fantastic website. So is this legal? What are they doing in South Africa? This lady brought up these people on the Comrades Marathon that are being attacked by these people who are legitimized by having an embassy, a Palestinian embassy in South Africa. So there's a Jew hatred theme anti-Zionist, anti-Jew, anti-Semitic, whichever label you want to get it, is Islam-based, Islamic-based. But if there's no state of Palestine, how do they have an embassy in South Africa?
Okay, so number one, you should absolutely explore if there's any legal remedies to that. But I'm going to take it to a different space, okay? I'm Palestinian. There is no such thing as an exclusively Muslim Palestinian identity. Palestinian is our N-word. We were conquered by the Romans. Judea Samaria was renamed Palestine, and my ancestors have identified as Palestinian for hundreds of years. My ancestors had Palestine on their passport as their identity before the establishment of the State of Israel. The Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post. The Israeli Orchestra, Philharmonic, used to be called the Palestinian Orchestra. I am a Palestinian. There is no such thing as an exclusive Muslim Palestinian identity. It is not an ethnic identity. It is not a religious identity. It's a geographical location that I have as much claim to as anyone else, number one. Number two, we cede the space when we speak with the terminology of our opponents, right? When we use terms like occupation, I cringe every time an Israeli government official uses the term occupation. You cannot occupy what you own. When we use terms like Israel-Palestinian conflict, which I've used with the so-called in front for the sake of this talk, there is no conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I say Palestinian Muslim or Palestinian Jew. There's no exclusive identity. There is a proxy war on behalf of Iran that is funding proxies and using the Muslim population as fodder and as human shield. There's no conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. There's no such thing as a two-state solution. Creating a Palestinian Islamic state in a sea of failed theological dictatorships is not a solution to anything. There's no such thing as a settlement. There's Jewish homes. There's Jewish people. I don't know what a settler is. There's Jewish people, and they have every right to live wherever they want in peace and security. If I told you that there was a 10-block radius in Belgium that said no Jews allowed, you'd say that's unacceptable. But when I tell you that there is a state that should be Jude and Rhine, why is that not acceptable? When I tell you that it is illegal for Jews to pray on the Temple Mount under Israeli control, how come every single major Jewish organization and leader has not come out against that policy? If I told you that I would be arrested for praying on the streets of Paris, we'd be up in arms. But Israeli police are arresting Jews for exercising their freedom of religion on the Temple Mount because our presence apparently is a provocation to terror. When I heard that was happening, when I heard that Jews were being arrested on the Temple Mount, and an organization came to us and complained, I thought, well, what would Kamala Harris do, right? So I set up the Temple Mount Bail Fund, that any Jew who is arrested for lawfully, peacefully assembling and praying on the Temple Mount is bailed out of jail and provided with pro bono legal counsel. And not only have we been winning with this amazing group run by a gentleman named Tom Nisani out of Israel, he has made it to the Supreme Court of Israel twice and won. It is now legal to hold an Israeli flag on the Temple Mount, and it is legal to pray on the Temple Mount, even though the law sometimes is not being enforced. And after those legal victories, the amount of Jews that have ascended to the Temple Mount has increased over 300% because they feel that they will be protected and their civil rights will be protected. Sometimes it's not about arguing in a defensive way with our enemy's paradigm and their false language. It's about asserting yourself and speaking the truth no matter how politically incorrect that truth is. And you'll see the narrative will shift naturally. I mean, a perfect example would be to go to this embassy as Jews and demand passports and prove our identity.
Brooke, it's been a fantastic evening, but you weren't brought here as entertainment. If we wake up tomorrow morning and we say, wow, what a fantastic talk last night, and nothing changes, then you failed. So the advice I want you to give us is, how is tomorrow different when each of the people here and the thousands and thousands of people who've watched us on Facebook and Zoom and YouTube tonight, what do they do differently tomorrow to make sure that your trip to South Africa was really worthwhile?
So, number one, pull up Instagram and follow End Your Hatred. Because if I don't gain some followers from this trip, I have failed. It's just the simple narrative. You got to wake up tomorrow and you have to understand it is not my responsibility to make people love Israel. That's not my responsibility. And even to students, it's not their responsibility to stand up for Israel, but it is their responsibility to stand up for themselves. And that's what you have to think about. How am I going to be a proud Jew today who is not intimidated? I don't need people to love Israel. I need people to fear the consequences of engaging in hatred and anti-Semitism. That is the goal. How do I shift the narrative? I don't have any prerogative or responsibility to respond to racist accusations, but what am I doing today? What is part of my civic duty as living in a democracy to ensure that my rights as a Jew, as a minority, are protected? That's just the paradigm shift.
So Brooke, I keep on calling you Brit because Brit
why?
is busy watching us. We've had some issues with sound tonight. And for those people who've struggled with sound, we will get out a clean copy of the audio tomorrow, and Brit will, in fact, be doing that. She'll be sending out a clean copy tomorrow to everyone. But I think the one thing that you've given us is you've given us the confidence to stand up and be who we really are. We have nothing to be ashamed of. We have nothing to be frightened of. We are not guests in South Africa. Our community has been here for more than 150 years. We are as much part of the soil of Africa as Julius Malema is. We are as much part of the soil of this country as Cyril Ramaphosa. And if they don't like it, they can leave, because we're not. And the one thing that you have told us this evening is, as South Africans, stand up for who you are. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. And be proud of 3,000 years of heritage and the gifts that we as a community have given to the world and have given to South Africa. Let South Africa be grateful for who we are and what we have done for this nation. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Great.
Guys, good evening. Thank you all. No sound. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for being with us tonight. We are so grateful for your time and for the support for the South African Zionist Federation. Brooke, I'm inspired. I want to get out and fight more. I want to make a noise, and I want to grow bigger Beitzim, and I want to fight to be a very, very proud Jew in this country. You inspire me, you inspire us, and a small token of our appreciation from the South African Zionist Federation that you flew all the way to the tip of Africa. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thank you for having me, for trusting me. I appreciate it. It's been an honor. Thank you, Howie. It's good.